Start so that we can also leave enough time for discussion after each of the presentations. I just wanted to begin by thanking again everybody at Verso Books and the crew who has been filming and making this possible. I know that a lot of people are watching this also online. Yesterday, Jake told me that it is actually possible to send questions from online. So yesterday, some people were making comments. If you have questions, we might be able to bring up some of those questions during the Q&A at the end. So as usual, we are not going to do any of the academic presentations. We're going to start straight away with Jodi Dean, who's going to talk to us about communist desire.
In a widely cited essay published in 1999, Wendy Brown uses Walter Benjamin's term left melancholy to diagnose the melancholia of the contemporary left. Her concern in the essay, which closely tracks Stuart Hall's discussion of the rise of Thatcherism, is to analyze the fears and anxieties of a left in decline, a left that is backwards-looking, self-punishing, attached to its own failure, and seemingly incapable of envisioning an emancipatory egalitarian future. Timely and evocative, Brown's essay for many seemed to capture a truth about the end of a certain sequence or history of the North American, British, and European left. Attuned to the ends and loss occasioned by the disintegration of the we previously held in common by the discourse of communism, in her words, to the unaccountable loss and unavowedly crushed ideal contemporarily signified by the terms left, socialism, Marx, or movement, Brown provided an opportunity to reflect on the failures and continuities in left projects in terms of the desires that sustain them. Her treatment of a lost historical moment thus suggested a kind of left coming to grips with or facing of reality, the reality of neoliberal capitalism and the defeat of the welfare state. Read from the expanse of more than a decade, however, Brown's essay is less convincing, for now it appears to err in its basic account of what was lost and why. Her discussion of Benjamin is misleading, her treatment of Freud is one-sided. Nonetheless, by analyzing the left in terms of a general structure of desire, establishing the contours of a key mode of left theorizing, Brown opens up possibilities for reconceiving communist desire. Possibilities I'll try to sketch out today. And I'm going to begin with a discussion of Benjamin and Freud, and then I'll turn to Negri, Badiou, Lukács, and Lenin, and then Occupy Wall Street. Left-Wing Melancholy is the title of Benjamin's 1931 review of the poetry of Erich Kästner. Kästner is best known for his children's book, Emile and the Detectives. It has a Facebook page, a realistic story of money and theft set in 1929 Berlin. Kästner's ironic light verse and sobering satire appealed to middle-brow Weimar readers, attracted to its seemingly honest portrayal of a stark reality. Benjamin himself disparages Kästner's poetry. He describes it as giving way to the complacency and fatalism of those who are most remote from the processes of production and whose obscure courting of the state of the market is comparable to the attitude of a man who yields himself up entirely to the inscrutable accidents of his digestion. In a further essay, the author as producer, Benjamin uses Kästner as the example of the new objectivity, a literary movement that Benjamin argues has made the struggle against misery a consumer good. Citing a perceptive critic, actually himself, writing in Left-Wing Melancholy, Benjamin quotes his earlier piece. These extreme left-wing intellectuals have nothing to do with the workers' movement. Their function, seen from a political point of view, is to form not a party but a clique. Seen from a literary point of view, not a school but a fad. From an economic point of view, not to become producers but agents. Agents are hacks who make a great show of their poverty and congratulate themselves on the yawning void. As far as Benjamin is concerned, left-wing writers such as Kästner have no social function other than rendering the political situation into amusing content for public consumption. Most generally put, Benjamin's critique in both Left-Wing Melancholy and the author as producer targets intellectual compromise, adaptation to the market, and the betrayal of the workers' movement, particularly insofar as this compromise, adaptation, and betrayal banks on and cans authentic revolutionary impulses already part of everyday proletarian life. Brown claims that left melancholy is Benjamin's unambivalent epithet for the revolutionary hack who is, finally, attached more to a particular political analysis or ideal, even to the failure of that ideal, than to seizing possibilities for radical change in the present. I disagree. Nowhere in his review of Kessner does Benjamin fault him for a lingering attachment to political ideals. Benjamin, in fact, makes the opposite point, condemning Kessner for writing poems that are blind to action because their beat very precisely follows the notes according to which poor rich folks play the blues. Benjamin describes Kessner's lyricism as protecting, above all, the status interest of the middle stratum, agents, journalists, heads of departments. It noticeably abandons any striking power against the big bourgeoisie and betrays its yearning patronage with a heartfelt sigh. Its yearning for patronage with a heartfelt sigh. If only there were a dozen wise men with a great deal of money. For Benjamin, Kessner is a hack because his left-wing radicality is a pose, a fashion trend, a commodity. Kessner is not attached to an ideal. He has compromised revolutionary ideals by reducing them to consumer products. Now, Brown argues, if the contemporary left often clings to the formations and formulations of another epoch, one in which the notion of unified movements, social totalities, and class-based politics appeared to be viable categories of political and theoretical analysis, this means that it literally renders itself a conservative force in history, one that not only misreads the present, but installs traditionalism in the very heart of its praxis, in the place where commitment to risk and upheaval belongs. In our present of undeniable inequality, class war, and ongoing capitalist crisis, the relevance, indeed the necessity of unified movements and class-based analysis is undeniable in a way that it was perhaps not when Brown was writing at the end of the 90s. This clarity helps eliminate Benjamin's own position as opposite to the one Brown takes. Unlike Brown's, Benjamin's left melancholic is the one who gives way to complacency and fatalism, ceding desire like the satiated man who can no longer devote all his money to his stomach. What then of melancholia? The most valuable aspect of Brown's analysis comes from her turn to Freud's 1917 paper on melancholia, to provide an account of a particularly left structure of desire. As is well known, Freud distinguishes melancholia from mourning. Mourning responds to the loss of an object of love, whether that object is a person, country, freedom, or ideal. Over the time of mourning, the subject painfully and piecemeal confronts the reality of her loss. Slowly, she withdraws her attachment to the lost object. The work of mourning is complete when the subject is again free, uninhibited, and capable of love. As in mourning, the melancholic subject presents an absence of interest in the outside world and a general inhibition of activity. The crucial difference is that the melancholic's lowering of self-regard is manifest in a self-reproach and self-reviling that exceeds self-punishment, extending to the very overcoming of the instinct which compels every living thing to cling to life. The death drive, the force of loss, reformats the structure of desire itself. Freud writes, "The melancholic displays something else besides which is lacking in mourning, an extraordinary diminution in self-regard, an impoverishment of his ego on a grand scale. In mourning, it is the world which has become poor and empty. In melancholia, it is the ego itself. The patient represents his ego to us as worthless, incapable of any achievement, and morally despicable. He reproaches himself, vilifies himself, and expects to be cast out and punished. He abases himself before everyone and commiserates with his own relatives for being connected with someone so unworthy." Now, Freud accepts the melancholic subject's self-accusation. The subject really is weak, dishonest, petty, egoistic. The accuracy of the melancholic self-description then isn't at issue. It's basically correct, and Freud accepts it. Quoting Freud, the subject, has lost his self-respect, and he must have good reason for this. The real question is why the subject has lost his self-respect, what the good reason for this loss is. And I'm going to return to that in just a minute. Now, Brown uses Freud's account of melancholia to understand the fears and anxieties preventing the left from revising its anachronistic habits of thought. She highlights the persistence of melancholic attachment to a lost object, a persistence that, in superseding conscious desires to recover, to move on, renders melancholia a structure of desire rather than a transient response. She emphasizes as well the shift of the reproach of the loss of the loved object onto the left subject, a subject that preserves the love or idealization of the object even as the loss of this love is experienced in the suffering of the melancholic. Recounting some of the many losses on the left of local and international community, of a moral and political vision capable of sustaining political work, of a historical moment, Brown asks whether there might also be a still unconscious, unavowed loss, namely, of the promise that left analysis and left commitment would supply its adherents a clear and certain path toward the good, the right, and the true. She suggests that this promise formed the basis for left self-love and fellow feeling. So long as it remains foundational, unavowed, and untransformed, it will doom the left to self-destruction. Freud's study of melancholia enables Brown to bring to light the disavowed attachment underlying the fierce debates over post-structuralism and the status of the subject characteristic of a particular mode of left theory. Brown asks, what do we hate that we might preserve the idealization of that romantic left promise? What do we punish that we might save the old guarantees of the left from our wrathful disappointment? The answer, she suggests, is that hatred and punishment are symptoms, strikes we wage upon ourselves so as to preserve the promises and guarantees of left analysis itself. Scorn for identity politics and disparagement of discourse analysis, postmodernism, and trendy literary theory is the displaced form of narcissistic attachment to Marxist orthodoxy. It's an attack aimed at an interiorized object, the loved and lost object that promised unity, certainty, clarity, and political relevance. Now, a benefit of Brown's discussion is its illumination of a certain fantasy in left desire. Left melancholia extracts historical experiences of division, contestation, and betrayal from the Marxist tradition in theory and socialist states in practice. In their place, it leaves an invincible, reified figure of the master, one that is itself split between its authoritative and its obscene enactments. When leftists, stuck in their failure, blame this failure on post-structuralist theory and identity politics, Brown suggests, they disavow the non-existence of such a master. Clinging to an impossible, fantastic Marxism that never existed, they protect themselves from confronting the loss of its historical time, the end of the sequence beginning in 1917 or perhaps 1789. They shield themselves from the passing away of a time when it made sense to think in terms of the determinism of capital and the primacy of class. Now, is Brown right? Having diagnosed left immobility and self-loathing as melancholic, does she correctly identify what was lost and what is retained, what is displaced and what is disavowed? And does her account of melancholia as a structure of desire exhaust the potential of her move to Freud? Or might additional elements of his analysis also prove helpful for coming to grips with the left and the force of loss? Benjamin's own account of left-wing melancholia suggests a loss of a different sort than Brown's, the betrayal of revolutionary ideals, of the proletariat. He criticizes Kessner and other new objectivists not only for clinging to a form marked by the depiction of the brutalities of everyday life, but for commodifying this form, for packaging up the traces of spiritual goods as so much commercial content to be marketed and sold to the bourgeoisie. What Brown construes as a real loss of socialist ideals for which the left compensates via an obstinate and narcissistic attachment, Benjamin presents as compromise and betrayal, a compromise and betrayal that ideological identification with the proletariat attempts to displace. Brown suggests a left defeated and abandoned in the wake of historical change. Benjamin compels us to consider a left that gave in, that sold out. Freud's gesture to the melancholic's loss of self-respect points in a similar direction. To be sure, he's not explicit here. Nonetheless, the example he takes from the clinic hints at why the subject loses self-respect. Describing a woman who loudly pities her husband for being tied to such an incapable wife, Freud observes that she is really accusing her husband of incapacity. Her reproaches, he writes, derive from the pros and cons of the conflict of love that has led to the loss of love. Might it not be the case, then, that the woman is quite rightly recognizing her own incapacity in finding a capable husband, one capable of sustaining her desire? Might she not be punishing herself for compromising, for making do, for allowing the pros and cons of the conflict of love to constrain her desire as she acquiesces to a reality of acceptance and moderation to which there seems to be no alternative? If the answer to these questions is yes, then the woman's loss of self-respect is an indication of the guilt she feels at having ceded her desire. To use the terms given to us by Lacan, the only thing one can be guilty of is giving ground relative to one's desire. The woman's identification with her husband is a compromise, the way she sublimates her desire so as to make him the object of it. The ferocity of her superego and the unrelenting punishment to which it subjects her indicates that she has given up on the impossibility of desire's own constitutive dissatisfaction, to accommodate herself to everyday life. Freud notes the delight superego takes in torment, as well as the fact that the subject enjoys it. He writes, "The self-tormenting in melancholia, which is without doubt enjoyable, signifies, just like the corresponding phenomenon in obsessional neurosis, a satisfaction of trends of sadism and hate which relate to an object and which have been turned round upon the subject's own self." His analysis here uses the terminology of the drives set out in Instincts and Their Vicissitudes. In that essay, Freud says that the drives undergo the following vicissitudes: reversal into their opposite, turning round upon the subject's own self, repression, and sublimation. As Lacan makes clear, what is crucial in the Freudian account of the drives is the way drive provides the subject with another way to enjoy. The enjoyment, jouissance, that desire can't attain, drive can't avoid. Unable to satisfy or maintain desire, the subject enjoys in another way, the way of the drive. If desire is always a desire to desire, a desire that can never be filled, a desire for a jouissance or enjoyment that can never be attained, drive functions as a way to enjoy through failure. In drive, one doesn't have to reach the goal to enjoy. The activities one undertakes to achieve a goal become satisfying on their own. Further, as Zizek argues, the shift from desire to drive affects a change in the status of the object. Whereas the object of desire is originally lost, which emerges as lost, in drive, loss itself is an object. In other words, drive isn't a quest for a lost object, it's the enactment or loss, or the force loss, it's the enactment of loss, or the force loss exerts on the field of desire. Drives don't circulate around a space that was once occupied by an ideal, impossible object. Rather, drive is the sublimation of desire as it turns back in on itself, this turning thereby producing the loop of drive and providing its own special charge. An emphasis on the drive dimension of melancholia, on Freud's attention to the way sadism in melancholia is turned round upon the subject's own self, leads to an interpretation of the general contours shaping the left that differs from Brown's. Instead of a left attached to an unacknowledged orthodoxy, we have one that has given way on the desire for communism, betrayed its historical commitment to the proletariat, and sublimated revolutionary energies into restorationist practices that strengthen the hold of capitalism. This left has replaced commitments to the emancipatory, egalitarian struggles of working people against capitalism, commitments that were never fully orthodox, but always ruptured, conflicted, and contested. It has replaced these commitments with incessant activity, not unlike the mania Freud also associates with melancholia. And so now this left satisfies itself with criticism and interpretation, small projects and local actions, particular issues and legislative victories, art, technology, iPhones, iPads, procedures, and process. It sublimates revolutionary desire to democratic drive, to the repetitious practices offered up as democracy, whether representative, deliberative, or radical. Having already conceded to the inevitability of capitalism, it noticeably abandons any striking power against the big bourgeoisie, to return to Benjamin's language. For such a left, enjoyment comes from its withdrawal from responsibility. its sublimation of goals and responsibilities into the branching, fragmented practices of micropolitics, self-care, and issue awareness. Perpetually slighted, harmed, and undone, this left remains stuck in repetition, unable to break out of the circuits of drive in which it is caught, unable because it enjoys. Might this not explain why such a left confuses discipline with domination, why it forfeits collectivity in the name of an illusory individualist freedom that continuously seeks to fragment and disrupt any assertion of a common or of an ism? The watchwords of critique within this structure of left desire are moralism, dogmatism, authoritarianism, and utopianism, watchwords enacting a perpetual self-surveillance. Has an argument, position, or view inadvertently risked one of these errors? Even some of its militants reject party and state, division and decision, securing in advance an inefficacy sure to guarantee it the nuggets of satisfaction drive provides. If this left is rightly described as melancholic, and I agree with Brown that it is, then its melancholia derives from the real existing compromises and betrayals inextricable from its history, its accommodations with reality, whether of nationalist war, capitalist encirclement, or so-called market demands. Lacan teaches that, like Kant's categorical imperative, the superego refuses to accept reality as an explanation for failure. Impossible is no excuse. Desire is always impossible to satisfy. A wide spectrum of the contemporary left has either accommodated itself in one way or another to an inevitable capitalism, or taken the practical failures of Marxism-Leninism to require the abandonment of antagonism, class, and revolutionary commitment to overturning capitalist arrangements of property and production. Melancholic fantasy, the communist master, authoritarian and obscene, as well as sublimated melancholic practices, there was no alternative, shield this left, shield us, from confrontation with guilt over such betrayal as they capture us in activities that feel productive, important, and radical. Now, maybe I should use the past tense here and say shielded, because it now seems more and more that the left has worked through its melancholia. In a setting marked by a general acceptance of the end of communism and of particular political theoretical pursuits in ethics, affect, culture, and ontology, it may now be less accurate to describe the left in terms of a melancholic structure of desire than to point to the fragmentation or even non-existence of a left as such. Brown's essay might then be thought of as a moment in and contribution to the working through and dismantling of left melancholia. In its place, there are multiple practices and patterns which circulate within the larger academic theoretical enterprise, which has itself already been subsumed within communicative capitalism. Some of the watchwords of anti-dogmatism remain, but their charge is diminished, replaced by more energetic attachment to new objects of inquiry and interest. The recent reactivation of communism also bears witness to the end of melancholia as a structure of left desire. Describing the massive outpouring of enthusiasm for the 2009 London Conference on the Idea of Communism, Duzenes and Zizek note that even the question and answer sessions were good-humored and non-sectarian, a clear indication that the period of guilt is over. Similarly, in his own contribution to the communist turn, Bruno Bastiles glosses the idea of the communist horizon, as invoked by Alvaro Garcia Linera. In contrast to melancholia's self-absorption, the communist horizon affects, Bruno writes, a complete shift in perspective, or a radical ideological turnabout, as a result of which capitalism no longer appears as the only game in town, and we no longer have to be ashamed to set our expecting and desiring eyes on a different organization of social relationships. Is it possible to understand this reactivation of communism in terms of desire? And if so, in what sense? I think that it is. And in the rest of my talk this morning, I want to offer a provisional sketch of what such a communist desire might look like. And I have two theses. First, communist desire designates the subjectivation of the gap necessary for a politics, which is the division within the people. Second, this subjectification is collective, our desire and our desire for us. The contemporary rethinking of communism provides at least two paths toward a concept of communist desire: the desire of the multitude and the desire of the philosopher. The first comes from Negri's, Spinoza, and Deleuze-inspired emphasis on the productive desire of the multitude of singularities. Negri emphasizes that the multitude is a totality of desires and trajectories of resistance, struggle, and constituent power. The second, the desire of the philosopher, and that's an expression provided by Alessandro Russo. I use that to tag Badiou's emphasis on the eternity of communism. In a text from 1991, Badiou argues that the so-called death of communism wasn't an event. The political sequence associated with October 1917 had already long been dead. Communism, as a political truth, names an eternity, not an historical state formation, so it can't die. It necessarily exceeds any particular instantiation. Badiou gives further expression to the philosophical idea of an eternal communism with his communist invariants: the egalitarian passion, the idea of justice, the will to end the compromises with the service of goods, the eradication of egoism, the intolerance towards oppression, the desire for the cessation of the state. So to reiterate, there's Negri, who writes, communism is possible because it already exists in this transition, not as an end, but as a condition. It is development of singularities, the experimentation of this construction, and in the constant wave of power relations, its tension, tendency, and metamorphosis. And there's Badiou, who treats communism as a trans-historical truth, a regulative ideal capable of grounding, Badiou uses the word incorporating, a subject in history. In one version, communism is already imminent in the world. In the other, communism is the real of a truth that introduces the impossible into the world. These two seemingly opposed approaches to communist desire operate similarly. Each points in its own way to an underlying communist necessity or unavoidability, a kind of communist absolute. Whether as the real existing power of the multitude or the real of a truth procedure in the symbolic narrative of history via an individual's subjectivation, communist desire is a given. What Negri positions within the totality of capitalist production in the present, Badiou positions within the eternity of the philosophical idea. Negri and Badiou are reassuring. For those committed to egalitarian universalism and unwilling to accommodate themselves to the era's dominant capitalist realism, they establish places to stand, sites from which to think and act and understand thinking and acting. As communism, socialism, the working class, and the social welfare state have all been vilified and dismantled, as utopian ideals and as post-war compromise, this reassurance has been essential to the maintenance of courage, confidence, and even knowledge of revolutionary theory and practice. At the same time, as Brown's discussion highlights, such reassurance can and sometimes does become an object of fetishistic attachment. It provides a guarantee as if the time for guarantees had not passed, something to hold on to in a setting of absence, in a setting where loss itself operates as a force. The reassuring promise from Negri is that communism has already arrived. It needs only to be released from its capitalist constraints. Rather than a political economic field ruptured by division and antagonism, where the desires and activities of producers conflict with themselves and with each other, the desire of the multitude appears as an already given convergence, abundance, and wholeness, shielding us from confrontation with the gap within and between us. The reassurance from Badiou is not only that there are truths, but that these truths are from time to time incorporated in the world. The implicit promise is then that the political truth of the idea of communism will again be incorporated in new subjects. Rather than a conviction forcing the divisions of an enactment by a party and a state, the desire of the philosopher appears as a form of thought that may guide or direct the affective attachments of those who contemplate it. Rather than a ruptured field of practical and theoretical knowledge and will, this desire manifests itself as a form that sees and impresses itself on history's varying rebellious subjectivities. The subsumption of all ongoing political struggles into the multitude, even if this multitude is one of singularities, disavows the tensions and oppositions among them, as well as the ways that these tensions are and can be manipulated in the interests of capital. The absorption of all past popular struggles into a content unchanging over the course of millennia discounts the impacts of prior struggles on later ones, as well as the material and technological determinations of forces, capacities, and interests. One doesn't have to embrace the historicists' happy positivism to argue that the communist combination of emancipation and egalitarianism is unique. It is informed by multiple other struggles, as Marx already makes clear in distinguishing, for example, between bourgeois and proletarian revolutions, and his 20th century struggles for civil and women's rights, and 21st century struggles for gay and trans rights attest. But communism is not the same as these struggles. Second, and consequently, communism is informed by its own failures and mistakes, and informing repressed by reassuring appeals to communist entirety or invariance. This is why there's an endeavor to rethink communism today, to critique and learn from the past in order to instantiate something better this time. There are specific histories and struggles whose successes and failures can continue to inspire, that can, but may not, incite a desire to look at our present differently, to see it in light of the communist horizon. What interest is served in disavowing knowledge of the differences among struggles beneath the expanse of an eternal communist substance? If there was a left structure of desire appropriately understood as melancholic, and if that structure no longer holds, then some sort of work or working through has taken place. Such a work would have already called into question all-encompassing visions of a communism persisting apart from, rather than through, centuries of struggles and the signifying stresses they leave behind. A communism seemingly incapable of learning and adaptation, as well as of a communism uniting multiple struggles that patently refuse its terms. Whereas some might treat this work as traversing the fantasy or moving from the desire to the drive, I've argued that the sublimation of the drive captures the subject in the repetitive circuits of communicative capitalism. What's left? A new, shifted desire, one that recognizes the impossibility of reaching or achieving its object and holds on, refusing to cede it. Now, Zizek links this new desire to Lacan's notion of the desire of the analyst. Such a desire is collective, sustaining a community even as it has moved past the need for some kind of phantasmic support. Collectivity, built around a lack, provides a common desire capable of breaking through the self-enclosed circuit of drive without reinstalling a new authority or certainty. Now, even as they take communist desire as a kind of given, Negri and Badiou also contribute to this other thinking of communist desire, one that with Lacan associates desire with the constitutive role of lack. Desire depends on a gap, a question, a missingness, and an irreducible non-satisfaction. In this vein, and in contrast to his usual approach to desire, Negri writes, communist imagination is exalted in the moment of rupture. Badiou, too, albeit differently, emphasizes rupture, the rupture of the event in the normal order of bodies and languages as it exists for any particular situation. Each thereby links communism to a gap or a break, although, again, they differ in their theorization of this gap, or the time and place of this gap. Badiou expresses it well in his early writing. A militant obstinacy, a certain subjective form has always and forever accompanied the great popular uprisings, not when they are captive and opaque, like everything we see today, nationalisms, market fascination, mafiosi, and demagogues raised on a pedestal of parliamentarism, but rather in free rupture with being and situation, or counted being which keeps them in check. These emphases on rupture resonate with Rancière's emphasis on the division within politics between politics and the police. For Rancière, politics is the clash of two heterogeneous processes, the process of the police and the process of equality. He views the police as an order of bodies that defines the allocation of ways of doing, ways of being, and ways of saying. It's an order of the visible and the sayable. He then uses politics to designate whatever breaks with the tangible configuration whereby parties and parts, or lack of them, are defined by a presupposition that, by definition, has no place in that configuration, that of the part of those who have no part. So politics inscribes a gap within an existing order of appearance. the part of those who have no part is this gap in the existence order of appearance between that order and other possible arrangements, this space between and within worlds. The part of no part does not designate a subset of persons, a we or a concrete identity that can be empirically indicated. It names the gap, division, or antagonism that marks the non-identity of any ordering with its components. The Lacanian term for the part of no part would then be objet petit a, an impossible formal object produced as the excess of a process or relation, a kind of gap that incites or annoys, the missingness or not quite rightness that calls out to us. It's the gap, the miss or non-identity between something simply present and something desired, the object cause of desire, or, returning to the political field, the gap between a politicized people and a population or set of persons. Rancière notes that political subjectivation is itself a disidentification and registration of a gap. He explains, there are political modes of subjectification only in the set of relationships that the we and the name maintain with the set of persons, the concrete play of identities and alterities implicated in the demonstration and the worlds, common or separate, where these are defined. So we have a rupture or a gap and the subjectivation of this gap. But subjectivation in what sense? There are different politicization, different mobilizations, and subjectivations that call out to and organize different convictions and interests. The gap necessary for communist desire is manifest in the non-coincidence of communism with its setting, a gap that is within and part of the setting, as Marxist themes of negation and the communist legacy of revolution both affirm. Communism is, of course, not the only political ideology that mobilizes negation and revolution. There are and have been liberal, democratic, bourgeois revolutions. And communism shares with capitalism a revolutionary mobilization of negation, hence communism is the negation of the negation. The difference is the ways they subjectivize the gap. That's what's crucial. Capitalist subjectivation, the desire it structures and incites, is individual, even as it tends to sublimate desire and drive, or differently put, even as individuated desires get caught up in and give way to drive's powerfully repetitive circuits. To invert Althusser, capitalism interpolates subjects as individuals. A communism that does likewise fails to effect a rupture or install a gap. Communist desire can only be collective, a common relation to a common condition of division. Rancière's connecting of political subjectivation to the gap between we and the set of persons points in this direction. It describes a common relation to a common condition of division that is subjectivized as the we of a collective subject. Negri directly and explicitly emphasizes collective desire. Badiou, in his writing on the death of communism, invokes a collective subject, albeit one that at the time of the collapse of the Soviet party state had been inoperative for more than 20 years. Badiou observes that it was the phrase "we communists," a nominal precision added to "we revolutionaries," which in turn gave political and subjective force to this "we," construed as an ultimate reference, the "we" of the class, the "we proletarians," which was never articulated, but which every ideal community posited as its source as a historical axiom. Or in other words, we faithful to the event of October 1917. Badiou tells us that such a sense of we informed his adolescent understanding of Sartre's praise, "every anti-communist is a dog," because, Badiou explains, every anti-communist thereby manifested his hatred towards the we, his determination to exist solely within the limits of the possession of himself, which is always the possession of some properties or goods. A constitutive component of the communist subjectification of the gap between what exists and what could be, between working and capitalist classes, between revolutionaries faithful to October 1917 and other political subjectivations, is the opposition between a collective we and an individual determined in and by his singular self-possession. The communist subject is not an ensemble or assemblage of individuals, but a force opposed to such an individualism and its attachments. Although our political problem differs in a fundamental way from that of communists at the beginning of the 20th century, we have to organize individuals. They had to organize masses. Lukács's insight into individualism as a barrier to collective will formation is crucial to theorizing communist desire as collective desire. Lukács notes that the freedom of those of us brought up under capitalism is the freedom of the individual isolated by the fact of property, a freedom over and against other isolated individuals, a freedom of the egoist, of the man who cuts himself off from others, a freedom for which solidarity and community exist at best only as ineffectual regulative ideas. Lukács argues that the conscious desire for the realm of freedom can only mean consciously taking the steps that will really lead to it. In a setting of capitalism's distractions and compulsions, one may very well feel like something is wrong, something is missing, something is deeply unfair. Then one might complicate this idea or contextualize it and then forget about it and check email. Or one might try to make a difference, signing petitions and blogging and voting and doing one's own part as an individual. And here's the problem. One continues to think and act individualistically. Under capitalist conditions, communist desire entails the renunciation of individual freedom, the deliberate and conscious subordination of self in and to a collective communist will. This subordination requires discipline, work, and organization. It's a process carried out over time and through collective struggle. Indeed, it's active collective struggle that changes and reshapes desire from its individual, and for Lukács, bourgeois and reified form, into a common collective one. The most renowned and compelling account of the role of revolutionary struggle in constituting communist desire, that is, in reforming individual interests into a collective one, of course comes from Lenin. Lenin constantly insists on struggling, testing, learning, developing, forging. The overthrow of the old society cannot occur without prolonged effort and hard-won experience. In left-wing communism, Lenin presents a fundamental law of revolution. It is only when the lower classes do not want to live in the old way, and the upper classes cannot carry on in the old way, that the revolution can triumph. The lower classes have to want in a communist way. If they are to overthrow capitalism and begin establishing a communist society, they have to desire as communists. Without collective communist desire, revolutionary upheaval moves in counter-revolutionary directions. Lenin writes, "A petty bourgeois driven to frenzy by the horrors of capitalism is a social phenomenon which, like anarchism, is characteristic of all capitalist countries. The instability of such revolutionism, its barrenness, and its tendency to turn rapidly into submission phantasms and even a frenzied infatuation with one bourgeois fad or another, all this is common knowledge. Submission phantasms. Here Lenin designates a failure of collective will, a failure that seeks the cover of a master rather than holding fast to a communist desire to steer with courage and without certainty the conditions we are always ourselves already making." Now, in this provisional sketch of communist desire, I've emphasized the lack, the openness of desire, and its subjectivation. I've argued that communist desire is the collective subjectivation of an irreducible gap. Communist desire names the collective assumption of the division or antagonism constitutive of the political. Collectivity is the form of desire in two senses, our desire and our desire for us. Or communist desire is the collective desire for collective desiring. I want to now just take a very brief description of a contemporary figure for this collective desire, statistical identity. One of the slogans to emerge with particular power out of the September 17, 2011 move to Occupy Wall Street was, "We are the 99%. Instead of naming an identity, the number highlights a division and a gap. The gap between the wealth of the top 1% and the rest of us. As it mobilizes the gap between those who have 99% of the wealth and those who compromise 99% of the population, the slogan asserts a collective, a common. It does not unify this common under a substantial identity, race, ethnicity, nationality. Rather, it asserts it as the we of a divided people, the people divided between expropriators and expropriated. in the setting of an occupied Wall Street, this we is a class, one of two opposed and hostile classes, those who have and control wealth and those who do not. Differently put, the announcement that we are the 99% names an appropriation, a wrong. In so doing, it voices as well a collective desire for equity and justice, for a change in the conditions through which 1% seizes the bulk of collective wealth for themselves, leaving 99% with the remainder. Additionally, we are the 99% erases the multiplicity of individuated, partial, and divided interests that fragment and weaken the people. The count disindividualizes interest and desire, reformatting both within a common. Against capital's constant attempts to pulverize and decompose the collective people, the claim of the 99% responds with the force of a belonging that not only cannot be erased, but that capital's own methods of accounting produce. Capital has to measure itself, count its profits, its rate of profit, its share of profit, its capacity to leverage its profit, its confidence or anxiety in its capacity for future profits. Capital counts and analyzes who has what, representing to itself the measures of its success. These very numbers can be, and in the slogan, "We are the 99%, they are put to use. They aren't re-signified. They are claimed as the subjectivation of the gap separating the top 1% from the rest of us. With this claim, the gap becomes a vehicle for the expression of communist desire. That is, for a politics that asserts the people as a divisive force in the interest of overturning present society and making a new one anchored in collectivity and the common. In a close engagement with Catherine Malibu's discussion of severe brain injuries, Zizek discusses the logic of dialectical transitions. After negation, alienation, loss, the subject returns to itself, but this subject is not the same as the substance that underwent the alienation. It is constituted in the very movement of returning to itself. Zizek concludes, the subject is as such the survivor of its own death, a shell which remains after it is deprived of its substance. Proletarianization is a name for the process of this deprivation under capital. The deprivation of substance, common social substance, leaves collectivity as its shell, as the form that remains for communist desire. This collective form overlaps with the object cause of communist desire, the people understood as the part of no part. As I've argued, the part of no part names the gap or antagonism that marks the non-identity of any ordering with its own components. It can thus be designated with Lacan's Subjectification, an impossible formal object produced as the excess of a process, a missingness or offness that calls out to us. Zizek notes that for Lacan, the object of desire always remains at a distance from the subject. No matter how close the subject gets to the object remains elusive. The distinction between object and object cause accounts for this difference. There is a gap because the object cause is not the same as any old object to which it attaches. The object cause is what makes an object desirable, not a property inhering in the object. One might think that the object of communist desire would be a world without exploitation, a world characterized by equality, justice, freedom, and the absence of oppression, a world where production is common, distribution is based on need, and decisions realize the general will. Once one starts to describe this perfect world, though, it always comes up lacking. Something's always missing. What about an end to sexism, racism, and egoism? What about an end to social hierarchies? What about religious freedom and the intolerant? What about meanness and bullying? It's no surprise that communism's critics, at least as early as Aristotle in the Politics, criticized communism as utopian and impossible, because it just seems another word for perfect. But the impossible of communist desire is not the same as its cause. The object cause of communist desire is the people, and again, the people not as a name for the social whole, but as a name for the exploited producing majority. For any government, system, organization, or movement, the people remain elusive, incompatible with, and disruptive to what attempts to and disruptive to whatever it is that attempts to reduce, constrain, or represent it. Authoritarianism, oligarchy, aristocracy, representative democracy, parliamentary democracy, none of these forms worries too much about the disconnect between government and people. But the disconnect, the gap, matters for communism, and actually for fascism as well, which deals with the gap by essentializing the people via blood, soil, and the leader, and attempting to externalize and eliminate the remaining and unavoidable antagonism. But communism does worry about this gap, particularly because communism is not only a form of government, but also an organization of production. The people are elusive. They exceed their symbolic instantiation, as well as the images and fantasies that try to fill the gaps. Communist desire, a collective desire to desire communism, occupies and mobilizes this gap, recognizing its openness, that is, the impossibility of the people, and treating it as the movement of communism itself. Right? In the famous words from the German ideology, we call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. So, to conclude, I've attempted to set out an idea of communist desire in the space marked by the end of a certain left melancholy and by an alternative to the way of the drive. Whereas some have viewed drive sublimation as the alternative to a desire configured in terms of law and its transgression, I've sketched an alternative notion of desire, one that via collectivity breaks from drive's repetitive circuits. Instead of trapped in failure, getting off on, failing to reach our goals, communist desire subjectivizes its own impossibility, its constitutive lack in openness. Such subjectification is inextricable from collective struggle, from the impact of changes over time that enable the acknowledgement of faults, starts, and errors, of fantasy constructions and myths of completeness and inevitability. Precisely because such struggle is necessarily collective, it forges a common desire out of individuated ones, replacing individual weakness with collective strength.
Okay, we have plenty of time for questions and observations.
Thank you. Could you play a little bit more around and emphasize more the distinctions between these forms of solidarity and possibility in the communist desire and the fascist desire, which, recognizing these are oversimplifications and kind of archetypes at this point, but that was a very quick kind of one-liner around blood and soil and so forth. There are other kinds of fascisms, and I mean, I might be in favor of them, so I'm not saying that I want you to critique and show why fascism is bad or anything like that. I want you to play with exactly why this kind of solidarity and desire of the collective differs and how it differs from fascism, and see what more we can draw out from that distinction.
The difference has to do with substantializing and filling in the gap, saying that one can designate the people in some sort of closed or determined way, versus recognizing the openness and the necessary openness of the people. So I would call fascist desire that one that thinks to identify and substantiate the people, and communist desire one that holds that open necessarily sort of prevent fascism, because I don't think there's a defense of fascism.
So it's a matter of the universality in the way Badiou will talk about the necessity of universality so as to not be an evil? Is that another way to talk about it?
I want to insist on openness and non-substantiality, right? The fact that it can't be closed and it can't be filled in as these as this exact group, right? There can be a division, right? But the division that I'm talking about is one that has to do with ownership and property.
Okay.
Can I maybe propose a formula? One sentence.
Etienne also wanted to intervene. Just a second about this question.
Oh yeah, sorry.
I just want to add a footnote to your question, if you allow, which I think is crucial. Not incidentally, but to begin with, I found this a fantastic text, presentation, and analysis. If you ask the previous question, names matter, of course, enormously in this question, as you perfectly explained. If you ask the question in the form of how to differentiate, not why to differentiate, but how to differentiate communist desire from fascist desire, I don't say the answer is easy. It's but it's clear right from the beginning that the two cannot really interfere, in spite of historical circumstances in which things were. But if you ask the question not with the name fascism, but with the name populism,
Yeah, that's...
which today I think is a crucial issue to be discussed, and not in simplistic terms. And if you have such expressions as the cause of the people, haunting, so to speak, or still haunting any discussion about populism, then I don't say that you'll find yourself embarrassed, but I'm wondering what you would want to say to address this additional level of complexities, so to speak.
I think that's a good question. I don't think I can... I need to think more about that. What I would say right now is I would want to say that, first, the problems with populism are twofold. The first is the tendency towards kinds of substantialization in racist and religious and exclusive practices and self-identification. So that would be my first. I would basically try to answer that one by squishing it back into fascism. And then the other way I would answer it is to try to squish it back in, squish it over to capitalism, in that it's that populism remains a set of individuated folks moving, rather than trying to have a kind of self-conscious collectivity moving. So that would be my first initial pass.
I don't know if you've seen the news, but the Gap is closing, or at least it's shrinking. The Gap, the store, the clothing store.
Oh, the clothing store.
But that was announced this week, so I think maybe that's some kind of symbolic justice there. I would like to. I wonder if it's a structuring absence. This four-letter word, or the L word, love. Surprise, surprise. Zizek has said that love is evil, and I agree with him most of the time. But there's also the injunction to love one's neighbor. There's different forms of love, obviously. Stiegler, who has announced that there's sort of peak libido. We've run out of libido as a certain form of positive desire, and we're only left with drive. Mm-hmm. So he has this negative spin. I wonder, and yet this... The call for the army of lovers, the Bifo text and Lovink, I know you had some reservations with that language. I'm also thinking of Bataille's notion of eroticism, that it allows us to experience the gap, the vertigo of the gap together. Mm-hmm. So all of these terms overlap, I think, desire, eroticism, love, drive, and I think you did a great job at distinguishing different types of desire and all those important distinctions. But why then, is there any way, one more reference, Heidegger says that technology is an unreasonable demand of nature. Could love be, since I've argued that love is a technology, could love be an unreasonable demand that dovetails with the communist demand?
That's a hard question.
Well, the short one would be, why do you object to the deployment of the term love in specifically?
Because it sounds like Oprah to me. I mean, when I hear people talk about love in politics, it seems too much to affirm a kind of hyper-emotionalism I mean, so it's a very particular and contingent answer that I have about love. I mean, I think that the vertigo of being together I really like, and I need to, find a way to engage that. I really like that a lot. But it's the love language in, American society now that makes me not want to mobilize that term. Sure. Right? So there's not good theoretical reasons. I would call it a tactical reason. But I like the vertigo of being together. That I want to use. Okay. Thanks.
Susan.
Jodi, as always, I learn very, very much from your presentations, and yet I mean, and this is my inelegant mind, but I have trouble. Well, I can tell you the end question I'm going to ask, which is, what is the purpose of theory? That's going to be the end question. But to get there, I'm just going to say two things. One is, if I look, I mean, the 99% fortunately includes me. If it was the lower 40, it would not. None of us probably in this room. The students would be included, but people who have tenured jobs in universities make more than that. Fortunately, 99% will include us, and we can say, okay, we're still okay, right? But so, but what I'm talking about, let's say even 20 or 30% in the wealth pyramid, and the 1%, you have this huge class. I mean, middle class doesn't mean anything theoretically, analytically, in no way. Well, a term I'd like to reintroduce is not the petty bourgeois, because that's too French, excuse me, Etienne, but the petty capitalist. We're all petty capitalists, right? Our 401k plans, our mortgages, the price of our homes, so many ways we are petty capitalists, even when we, quote, invest in our children to send them to college, That's a kind of thinking, well, I don't have to have such a big pension fund because I got kids who went to medical school or something, right? This is a kind of, we are stuck in this system in a way that it seems to me is bad faith, but has nothing to do with my desire. I didn't want this to happen. There's a little article in the New York Times today about a person who wanted to stop dealing with a certain bank because they were screwing them with another charge on the credit card. And they had been convinced to bank online, and so to pull out all of your ways that you bank online was such a complicated process, they were stuck unless they wanted to spend 2 weekends of their free time getting out of that. Now, I have empathy with this because I think a lot of what political life is stymied by is this damned if you do, damned if you don't reality of people's lives, okay? So that's one side, is kind of like the empirical, objective, sociological side. And the other side is the psychological. And I know that for you, the theory of the sociological and psychological go together, but I'm trying to pull them apart because that's where I have trouble, right? And when it comes to desire, God, there's no authenticity in my life. Not between me and me, not between me and my nearest dear ones, not between my, in the sense of where do I have authentic desire, even to desire? The kind of, unless this is all just a kind of, I don't want to say regulative idea, but a kind of metaphor for how we can talk to each other about what really counts. And then I'm saying, for me, well, okay, is theory, this kind of theoretical intervention, a kind of metaphor for talking about what really counts? But I don't, what makes me want to end this system of capitalist exploitation can't be described by my psychoanalytic makeup, but that's just me, right? So I just have trouble because for me there are so many mediations between my psychological makeup which I try to curb in order not to, be awful to the people who I care about, right? How can I then say, but in its really authentic form, it's going to, solve the problems of the world and give me a solidarity with 99% of human beings, when I can't, nor do I think I should, do it one-to-one. Okay.
Maybe I should answer? Or?
Oh, no, but the question is, what kind of work does this theory do?
On the role of, I'll only be able to take a few things from your remarks. First, I think there's an answer to Etienne's question regarding the difference between fascism. We are all petit capitalists. That would be the populism, the populism side. That would be the populist slogan rather than the communist side. That would be the difference. We're all petit capitalists. I also think that on the standpoint of the empirical sociological dimensions of class, the fact that we have in the United States now roughly 10% structural unemployment, that increases to nearly 20% when you think of underemployment and temporary work and people who have left the job market. I don't think there's a middle class. I actually think all of the statistics and numbers talk about the unbelievable change in the last 30 years in the class composition of the United States. So, so empirically, it's simply not that there's this kind of wonderful, rich body of nice, secure, middle-class people who can bank on lasting 401ks. For crying out loud, the capitalism's broken, right? So I don't think that it's a matter of kind of looking around and everybody's, for the most part, doing all right. Additionally, I want to say that what is the purpose of theory? I think the purpose of theory is to provide weapons.
I was wondering how your notion of this kind of universal desire, how it's separated from the fascist desire, how the national question plays into that, because there are these obvious divisions within the 99% that you kind of touch on, but how historically, because that question has developed a lot in the left, especially in the 20th century, how has that development of the national question within the left, how does that play into your conception of this more universal desire, because there's been lots of debate, in the left about that, and you see that with all the left groups, and how does that fit into, I guess, your conception of communist desire?
Well, yes, of course, historically, the national question has been a problem. It's also been the case that historically, communism was the antithesis of nationalism, right? And I kind of get flummoxed when folks only think about it in terms of one side, right? Particularly now, right? Particularly last night, particularly yesterday, when the global dimension was and is so strong. So I think that basically part of understanding our moment and pushing it is not getting bogged down in the national question, but recognizing the international, recognizing the international communist movement right now.
Just a quick clarification on your understanding of the individual. I had a hard time with your idea of the common collective. I want to say, does it necessarily subordinate the individual? Would it be helpful to think of an atomic individualism versus a social individualism? Because it's not the we rooted in the social I, the social individual.
This part of my I guess rant or tirade about individualism is kind of like my, associating of love with Oprah. I think that right now in the United States, the problem is not insufficient attachment to individualism, but in fact the opposite. One of the most frustrating things at Washington Square Park last night is this guy gives this, fantastic, rousing speech of, and we will, occupy Washington Square Park. Everyone's like, yeah. Then someone comes in with, and this is, of course, our individual choice, and each individual has to make their own individual call to do this. And that's kind of like, well, no duh, right? Yeah, you're not trapped, right? You could go, but to keep emphasizing on and on, right? What is that serving, right? I don't think that is serving building collectivity, solidarity, and mutual responsibility, and the sense like, okay, yeah, we are going to be this together, and there will be folks who are going to, hold the line when the police come in. But to keep emphasizing individuality over and over, particularly in these settings, actually fragments that. It makes it much harder to have confidence that folks are going to be there when you need them to be there. So I am trying to push against that strand because I think that it too much affirms essentially affirms the capitalist, mediatized, participationist culture that we're already in.
Well, thank you for a wonderful presentation, Jodi. My question is why you have chosen to call this very Lacanian notion of desire that you're working with communist desire. Now, of course, anyone who is interested in interfacing Lacanian theory on the one hand with Marxist or communist political thinking on the other is faced with the thorny difficulties of Lacan's own conservatism in certain ways and the manner in which he talks about desire is not without a relation. But what I'm wondering is why you haven't chosen to call this instead, say, 99%er desire or socialist desire, because of course what you're talking about is subjectivizing this gap. Now, of course, communism, this is the very naive thought that lurks in the background here of this question. If communism is the abolition of class, if it's the 99% whose mission is ultimately in the longer stretch to erase that gap, or to close it, that the idea of subjectivizing it, here we come close to what both Slavoj and I have reservations about Badiou's recourse to the Kantian notion of the regulative ideal, where it's the old utopianism, the bad utopianism that Marx himself in Communism is a political movement is, I think, overall opposed to. Something we already have in the Republic with the Callipolis. Oh, it's the image of the beautiful city. We'll never actually get there, but it's about the asymptotic approach to that impossible ideal. And so, for me at least, when talking about this gap is absolutely essential to communist subjectivity or communist desire, well, it seems as though it would be more appropriate to say it is proper to a transitional desire, such as the dictatorship of the 99%, as opposed to the proletariat, etc. But that to enshrine it as almost a kind of permanent feature of a collective metapsychological, Lacan leverage conception of communism is not. There's a tension there with when we think of communism as the movement, the real movement that also leads to the abolition of that gap. So I'm just wondering what you'd have to say about that.
I think two things. First, I want to keep calling it communist desire because I don't want to think that we achieve it and have achieved it, or like even after this kind of endpoint. I think that the endpoint thinking is the wrong way to think about it. And that instead the way of thinking that no matter what kinds of sort of eliminations of property and common relations and common organizations of water and health and the sustainability of the planet and the development of better food, ways of producing and distributing food, that no matter what happens there, a desire has to keep alive, right? We have to continue to desire collectively. And will be fragile, right? That's not something that's a permanent feature of people. And that's not something that should be understood in such a substantialized way, but more in this open way. So that's the first part. The second part is, I want to think about it as a particularly communist desire, on the desire side now. And this is influenced primarily from my sort of reading and conversations with Bruno, who's persuaded me to think more about the subject. And I think that one of the mistakes in thinking about communism has been focused on the object, which then, not surprisingly, makes people really quite worried about, like, what exactly is that object going to look like, and how. And then you start to get, well, the object's always going to be failed, and then you start to see the dynamic of desire in that. It's like, oh, so really, the way to think about it is in what is it to desire like a communist, to shift the discussion towards the side of the subject rather than the object. So that's the reason for that.
Thank you very much. I really like the idea of a collective desire which desires to desire or continue to desire collectively. one question that came to my mind when you explicitly attacked the renouncement of the party model within Badiou as a framework of organization. Because, I mean, to pose a Žižekian question, what happens the day after the revolution, the emergence of that desire, how to organize it? And I saw different options, and I think, for example, the questions with regards to populism also are linked to that, because the openness that you, let's say, the unrepresentability of the people as such, offers a Lefordian way, the place of power is always empty, offers a Laclauian way, this is where the populism comes in, but also you seem to indicate via the reference to Rancière, one needs a dialecticized relation of politics and police. So then there is a model of integration, always a bit of police, organization, the people re-emerges politics and they're integrated, but you also, with your definition of communist desire as the common relation to the common ground of division, implied some sort of logic of purification in a Maoist sense. Because where are, to put it in with reference to Mao, where are the 1% after the revolution? They're in the 99. That would be the Maoist answer. So what to do then? Purify the 99% more and more to keep the openness. So, I mean, I saw these different strands, and I would like to know for which one you would opt.
I think that I don't know if I can answer that question very well. I think it's a really good question, and I need to think about it more. I mean, right, the 1% can't remain the 1%, right? They have to be, the conditions that make them the 1% have to change, and so we take their stuff, right? Or we, you know, I mean, honestly, if you really think about it more, or you think about it more tactically, right? I mean, what would actually, I mean, if I think about it on the, you know, sort of the second day, what happens is the financial networks have collapsed, and in fact, their stuff just vanishes because it's all ephemeral anyway. So to that extent, they become not the 99%, I mean, they become not the 1% anymore, and then we'll need to learn not to treat everybody else as a servant. Yeah.
I have just a short question, and a simple question. So a few days ago I was on Cyprus and asked my friend, so you will also have 15th of October movement, and I was pretty enthusiastic about everything like you, and he said no, the right-wingers are actually using the 15th of October movement to impose anti-immigration rules and so on. Yeah. Also yesterday in Croatia, where I come from, and where the movement for direct democracy is stronger and stronger, you have an interesting situation that the radical left and the radical right come there and protest against the European Union. In US, you have the interesting situation that the Tea Party and also the radical left are for the taxation of banks and so on. So my question is actually, what leads you to the thesis that this all is actually an international communist movement?
It's actually not a thesis. That's more like a
hope.
A hope. Yeah, but I also think it's an attempt to make that happen, right? It's an attempt to strengthen those parts of the discussion. It's an attempt to prevent the Tea Party line from becoming part of Occupy Wall Street. It's an attempt to exclude the Ron Paul people.
Yeah,
right?
but if
So
I remember well, Slavoj told
statement.
exactly that the Tea Party should become a member of Occupy Wall Street.
I think that's complete.
Yeah.
I think that's completely wrong. No offense.
Very short.
My question is no worth of going to the microphone, so I will speak from here.
But they can't hear it if they're watching on the.
You don't despise us by staying there. You show how you despise the people.
That's right.
So I was last night at the Wall Street.
Speak in the mic so that people can hear.
I was last night at the Wall Street there, and I was cruising around trying to see what's going on and how I can sensitize with the atmosphere there. And then I was looking at different sayings there on the walls, and people had something written on a paper and so on. So there's a one that I want especially Bruno to comment on it, and it's saying Trinidad and Tobago support Wall Street protest. If you can comment on that, I will appreciate that very much.
Trinidad and Tobago support the Wall Street protests. That's the sign.
What's the problem here? I don't see any paradox. Sorry?
If there is no comment, I'm okay with that. But I think there is a problem that
Which is?
Trinidad and Tobago support Wall Street protests.
Why?
I think that it's interesting.
They're not entitled, or?
Country from the periphery of the world is supporting something what is happening in the United States.
U.S. finance capital ruins the world. Of course the rest of the world would want it to fall.